So what we can obviously do is render the entire thing using obviously the particles I've obviously got in here. However, what we can also do is replace about 90% of these guys with additional shape facing particles, so you can create more kind of like dusty cloud stuff around the base around here, for example. Okay, because this is working quite well. However, obviously we need to try and get some additional detail in here. Now what I'd basically suggest is to break this up even further to make it kind of a little bit more interesting. Is obviously maybe introduce some additional wind space warps in here to obviously break it up a little bit of a touch, and obviously, like I mentioned at the beginning, break up the sides of this funnel a little bit as well. Now you'll notice it comes down a little bit here and then stops pretty much while the shadows are being calculated. Okay, so an additional thing to basically do is something that I introduced in my own personal reel when I actually developed this the first time round, and that was basically to add a bit of a handheld motion onto this setup. Now to do that, I simply rendered out the entire plate currently as is, and then the resulting sequence was then piped into a additional 3ds Max scene, which simply had a single plate with an animated camera in there that basically pushed in, so it tightened the frame a little bit, and then kind of had a bit of a noise on the rotation or on the target of the camera, so it simulated like a handheld motion effect. So what you could do is, like, once this entire thing's rendered out, bring the sequence into 3ds Max, apply it to a plane geometry in the scene, set the plane to self-illumination to 100%, and then stick another camera in there and literally animate the camera either by using a noise controller, so it's kind of subtle, or you could actually use a motion capture controller to actually capture the positions of your mouse, so you just need to move your mouse around a little bit, and then perhaps have, like, for example, your arrow keys to simulate or to be linked to the FOV of the lens of the camera, so therefore in essence you're basically controlling the zoom of the camera, so you can literally move around and zoom in and then zoom back out again and so on. And then when you actually bring the entire system into the comp, what you can then do is pull focus and add blurs in to give the impression that the camera is trying to focus. Now you'll notice that some of these areas are obviously working quite well. I'm just going to pause this at this particular stage. Okay, so this is working quite nicely around here. These are maybe a little bit on the dark, so you might want to kind of brighten these up a little bit because we're kind of losing a bit of the shadows here. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that we are obviously rendering this out straight onto the backplate. Now, you wouldn't normally do that in a production pipeline. I have to stress this. You would render each one of these guys out individually, so you can basically blend them together with a lot more control in a compositing piece of software. So you'd render out the funnel separately, you'd render out the barn separately, you'd render out each particle element separately as well, shadow passes, specular passes, the entire lot. Obviously you'd assign materials to it as well. That's pretty much the way I did it for the real piece as well. So obviously in my version you've kind of got more definition in the shadows and more kind of definition in the specular highlights, which because I've obviously pushed and pulled things around in the comp. Obviously the shadows matched to these guys over here. Compositing 101 really, to match the lights and the darks in the scene. So obviously bear that in mind when you're outputting this guy. So I would seriously suggest that you render this out using multiple layers and then stick the entire thing into the compositor and then push and pull it around with regards to your luminance and color match it, and then tweak the motion blur and so on and so on. Okay, about this stage into the sequence, about 114 frames in, we've got a relatively nice simulation going on here. We've got some nice debris that's being picked up by the ground here. Obviously we've got the barn animation already baked in that we've already did a test render for earlier on, so it's looking quite cool. Couple of things that I want to address, however. The amount of polygons that's been generated by this dust and debris at the base here, once we actually get to about this particular stage, we're about 114 frames in, is going to be about 11 million polygons. Now, the issue with this is the fact that if you're working with a 32-bit operating system and a 32-bit version of 3ds Max, then chances are you will encounter render issues. So if you're working with a 64-bit system like I have been when I originally designed the scene, you won't have any problems at all, especially if you're dealing with like a fair amount of memory, like 8 gig or 16 gig or anything more than that. So you will go through the entire length of the sequence and render out, without any problems. However, for those of you who are dealing with a 32-bit system, I think what I'll pretty much do here is I think I'll change some of the parameters of the amount of particles available in this guy down here. So to do that, I'm simply just going to choose this PF source intake debris, and I'm going to reduce this render percentage. I'm actually going to drop that down to about 250, just purely for safety. So if you are dealing with the 32-bit version of 3ds Max, I would seriously suggest you drop this down. Okay, with that value of 250 set up, one other thing I want to address, which is you can't really make out the dust particles and the kind of small fragments which are basically coming off the barn as it's kind of peeling away. So what I basically want to do is actually want to increase the size of these guys. Now the reason we can't actually physically see them is quite simply because it's being rendered directly onto this backplate, and the image motion blur is kind of smearing the backplate into the particles. So if you're actually rendering this out against black, or for it to go into a compositor, for example, you would be able to obviously see these guys. However, as we obviously in this example aren't we're actually rendering it straight onto the backplate, we can't physically see them because it's like I say, it's all blending together. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into this debris airborne and debris airborne 2, and I'm going to change this value here. I'm actually going to increase that slightly by making it unique, because obviously it's instanced further on into the in the other system over here, and I'm actually going to set this size to, let's say, about 0.7, and then this guy here I'm going to change this value to, let's say, about 1.5. So that should do that. So these guys will obviously stand out a lot more when it actually comes to rendering the thing. So now with this debris airborne shape size setup, what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to change the amount of particles present in the render for this guy as well. Again, it'll aid render times, and it will also basically prevent too many faces being produced at render time. So to do that, what I'm going to do, I'm actually not going to reduce this amount of particles down here, but what I will do is actually just quickly amend this render quantity multiplier in here. I'm just going to drop that down to 50%, so therefore the particles which are fed through the system, because they actually physically don't delete, they just stay within the scene till the end of the sequence. So by dropping this guy down, we're obviously going to reduce the amount of geometry in the scene. Now, it's a quick and easy way of doing things without having to start messing around with birth values or anything like that. I mean, like I say, you might even want to reduce the amount of impact particles in there as well. So in essence, we've reduced the percentages within this guy. We're reducing it in here as well, which is the two kind of main systems which are which will have the highest amount of particles in here. Quite simply, these guys in here won't really change over time, well, apart from this guy here. Well, this one will actually reduce in amount over time, quite simply because we've got this delete operator in here, but this one obviously won't, because it doesn't actually have any in there at all. So with that taken down, that one taken down as well, and also the shape operators changing here, I think what we'll do is we'll go through and re-render the sequence out. So I think we'll call it a day there. So hopefully you've enjoyed working on this scene. Apologies again because it's been so long to actually produce, but obviously it's quite a complex system, and obviously it takes a lot of time to obviously set up these things. So hopefully get an idea on how to set up these kind of complex particle systems, and hopefully you've enjoyed it. Obviously it's just going through and transforming the initial vertices, because obviously it's got to build up to frame 0 from frame -100. So I hope you've enjoyed this sequence. Hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and hopefully see you on the next one, and overall have fun with it. Thanks very much. Cheers. Take care. Bye bye.